Hello, everyone. My name is Gary London. I am Senior Principal of London Moeder Advisors, and I have with me today a member of our team, Dr. Norm Miller, formerly, or I guess to some extent still affiliated with University of San Diego, eminent real estate analyst, economist, and friend of ours. Good morning, Norm.
Good morning, Gary.
So I thought what we would do today is just have a conversation on the question, is there a national housing market? And the sort of instigator to asking that question is, of course, candidate Vice President Harris has proposed a $50,000 assistance down payment to prospective homeowners to get them into home ownership nationally. And while
I thought that was 25,000.
was it 25,000? Well, it's maybe in California. I've just inflated it. I don't know, but whatever. But no, you're right. You're right. It was $50,000 for small businesses and
Yes.
$25,000 for down payment home mortgages. And that and as much as I'm a supporter of Vice President Harris, I have some doubts about the effectiveness of this kind of proposal. And I thought it would be just fun, Norm, to discuss that this morning under the sort of context, is there a national housing market? And perhaps maybe I'll just set the table by saying that the answer is no, there is no national housing market. The only thing national about the housing market might be the price of money or interest rates. The government for our entire lifetime has had policies in place that encourage ownership. The government wants us to be an owner of housing. They've devised for many years incentives that aren't a direct subsidy to own housing, but they include, tax write-offs and federal loan programs and target opportunity zones and that sort of thing. But beyond that, I think the premise of my point is that every single metropolitan area, every housing market is distinct and unique, and we all have unique and conflicting housing needs. And just to put a finer point on it, well, you've corrected it to be a $25,000 down payment help to purchase a home would be perhaps somewhat helpful in many states in the central markets and the southern markets, but not really very helpful in California, certainly not in coastal California, or really all the way up the West Coast, or all the way up and down the East Coast. So maybe with that as sort of a starting point, do you agree with me?
Well, I agree with you. There's not only there's no national market, there's no state market, there's not even a San Diego market. All markets are fairly localized, but taking the empirical perspective, 25,000 is probably 25% of a starter home in Detroit or Akron, Ohio. And in California, it's what? 3 to 5% of a starter home.
Well, if you think of the house of a starter home here in San Diego, say $900,000, $800,000, 10% would be just a little bit under $100,000, maybe 70, 80, 90,000. And if you're giving 25, you're basically talking about, you're right, 3 or 4%.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So
that may not be good enough.
So what it means on a relative basis is very little to California or San Diego, but plenty in Buffalo, Akron, Cleveland, places you and I don't want to live.
And actually, on that point, and you've heard me make this before, those kind of places might become increasingly attractive in the coming years with climate change and movement of people and demographic changes. So we don't want to just discount the idea that this wouldn't be helpful for some markets. But what also interests me is the fact that I would also argue that this problem that we have of housing is less demand driven than it is supply driven, which is to say, in most of these markets, with the exception of the ones that you've just described or identified, certainly in California, we're just not able to build enough housing, not enough housing of the right type. And that is what has constrained the housing market, not so much the fact that people aren't out there with money to invest.
Oh, absolutely. It is a supply problem. But on the demand side, if you stimulate demand, historically, tax credits accrue as much to the seller as to the buyer, if not more so. So you give me a $10,000 tax credit, but you don't give it to everybody. You give it to 15 to 20% of the market, which would be the typical new buyer. Now I have an extra weapon to compete with you and you don't get that subsidy. So I'm going to outbid you, and that's why it accrues in part to the seller. So this is not really a net benefit to the buyer. It pushes the demand for the market, and it's a little bit inequitable to those that are not lucky enough to be new buyers to qualify.
In other words, the government sort of pricing in market interference, which is something that that ought to be a concern, not just to economists, but for everybody.
It is. If I'm not a first-time home buyer and I'm competing against one, I resent that if we're in the same, market, some market that we're competing for homes.
Yeah, yeah. What my immediate reaction to this also was that even if we're wrong and the proposal is correct, I think she suggested that the policy might create 3 million new home buyer, new housing projects, new housing units. And that to me seemed to be real excessive.
That's double what is realistic or possible with the most optimistic math based on historical construction trends. 3 million is about double what we could possibly see on the upside within one presidential term.
And then the other thing about this is that my immediate reaction to this was, nah, this isn't the way to do it. The way to do it, and I don't know if it's the federal government's role at all, or if there's a way to creatively impose federal government into the housing delivery system. But the problem with housing delivery is local. We've had some effort on the part of the state of California impose its will on cities' zoning and land use regulations by allowing, more liberal levels of density and height and that sort of thing to create more unit counts. And there's sort of a mixed bag of whether that's working or not. But really, certainly my entire career has been focused on the local municipalities and local public agencies' impact on delivery of housing. I mean, obviously, zoning codes, minimum lot sizes, infrastructure and service availability. These are the kinds of things that have held back new housing in terms of both allowing more housing units to be built, imposing all these costs and regulatory overlays on it, so it takes a lot more time to build housing. I mean, these are the things that we need to be focused on the housing market rather than the sort of fiction that there's a national fix for housing.
You're absolutely correct. You've been preaching smaller lot sizes, higher densities. I would add to it, and I think you touched upon it, building codes. If they were made more flexible and modernized so that it was easier to build modular housing and component housing without this slow system of inspecting every little increment the way we do now, but doing it in a modern way, or even in a factory, we could add to the efficiency of home building. And of course, that means more in places where land is cheaper than it does in California, but still, even here, it would help if we had a modernized building code and a faster system of approval.
Well, actually, you hit on something that's very interesting, which maybe this is where the federal government can be helpful and create some kind of national building standard code that all with some carrots, some incentives that local governments could all sign up to, so that there would be one standard that applies around the nation in terms of health and safety, so that the rules wouldn't be so incrementalized by municipality, and they wouldn't create the complexity that they have now. Maybe there's a way for the national government to sort of impose its will to simplify those things.
It's a good idea, and we could learn a lot from Japan and Germany because they have much more advanced building systems. Their approvals are much quicker. And we could probably take some benchmarks and put them out and suggest to the local governments, please learn about this and consider more flexible codes that they meet the same end goals, but they're not as rigid in terms of the system that assumes stick-built housing like most markets do.
Yeah. And I also want to point out that, it's important also that we have an emphasis on home ownership. I mean, I don't think that's where the government has been wrong. In San Diego, about 65% of the built environment over the last decade has been multifamily, mostly rental housing. And we're gradually sort of de-emphasizing the for sale component because of the affordability aspect to it. And, there's some sense that that's a problem because, well, in most cases, owning a home creates better neighborhood values, creates better communities, and most importantly, it creates wealth. You buy your first house and you move on as housing as you build equity in your housing market, and that's really part of the wealth building opportunity for most middle income persons, isn't it?
Well, in some markets around the country, owning hasn't been as beneficial as here, but in California, almost across the board, it's interesting that we complain so much about our cost of living and how high housing cost and taxes and so forth. But much of that, if not all of that, has been offset for the last decade for many of us by enormous home equity wealth creation from those same problems, if you will, that have run our appreciation rates up. And so if we assume that it's going to stay that way for the foreseeable future, then housing remains a good investment.
Yeah. I mean, I know countless numbers of persons who have huge home equity that are getting into well, baby boomers like us, getting into those ages where they're pre-retirement or retirement. A lot of their worth is tied up into their houses. And the idea is you can either borrow against that equity or sell the home and move to one of those forbidden places that you mentioned earlier. So that's kind of a big deal. And I also can't resist, I guess, the temptation to suggest that housing isn't just a standalone issue for the federal government. I mean, the idea of the government incentivizing housing can be broadly brought into the arguments of climate change, population replacement. We're under population replacement levels, and part of that's related to affordability of housing, the immigration crisis, deficits. I mean, there's a lot of political issues that housing is tied into. One of the critical things that we all need to be thinking about right now is these storms, which happened from Florida to North Carolina and took some places by
Just
surprise.
to Spain.
To Spain, yeah. I mean, basically, there's a global conversation about where people can live going forward and how they can live. And it's a existential issue for for multiple societies on the globe. And in the States, it certainly suggests that people are going to have to move and settle into different communities that wouldn't have been on their list to settle in, a generation ago or even a decade ago, and abandon or start to depopulate areas that have been nice to live in until climate change has sort of reared its ugly head in the form of hurricanes and tornadoes and floods and heat and all these things that suggest that there will be a movement northward. So maybe national housing policy can be built into policies to resuscitate some of these Rust Belt communities, which are going to be probably much more interesting to live in going forward.
Well, the problem with climate change in general is it happens so slowly over a generation or several generations that most of us don't feel the water boiling around us like the frog that doesn't know it's being cooked.
Yeah.
But the wake-up call has been the property insurance increases, particularly in the markets that you're talking about, the low-lying flood risk areas. And they've seen 300% increases in many parts of Florida, North Carolina, and up the coast on the east side, especially parts of Texas, Louisiana. I think that those high insurance costs are not only hurting those values for the first time, just recently, but are going to cause more of that migration that you're talking about. Because when we talk about housing affordability, We use prices, interest rates, and incomes in the typical realtor formula, and we should be using all of that plus property insurance and property taxes. And it totally changes the picture on affordability, and it makes those areas much less affordable. And the market's waking up to that now.
I think we're going to do an entire other video on just the impact on insurance on housing. I think that's clearly going to be already is in many communities a hot button issue that we need to address everywhere. So, in answer to the question, is there a national housing crisis? The answer is probably. Can it be cured at the national level? Probably not. Although the federal government does have some tools in their toolbox, or can create some tools to be of help here.
Yeah, the federal government could educate, could provide benchmarks, but most of the housing supply problem, as you point out, is local.
Thank you so much, Norm. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Gary.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone. We will see you soon.